November 11th, 1918 seemed to go down in history as a day when the war to end all wars ended. Truth and goodness had triumphed above the dark forces of the continent, and the eternal era of peace, prosperity, and freedom was about to come. The shackles of backward empires had been overcome, and the spirit of self-determination spread far to the edges of the world. 4 years of suffering were over. The brave soldiers who endured the greatest atrocities of the front could finally return to their homelands, to their families, praised as the heroes they were. Time was right to celebrate. At least, if you lived here. If not, well...
Wir haben ein Grab gegraben für lauter junge Knaben.
In the months leading up to the war end, the state of the German Empire looked more and more dire. While being victorious on the Eastern Front, the Western Front practically hadn't changed since the French counteroffensive at the Marne in 1914, and more or less stagnated pretty much since the Battle of the Somme. The spring offensive utterly exhausted the German reserves and overstretched the front massively. The following 100 Days Offensive and the American intervention only worsened the situation. At the home front, the populace was living in constant extortion, hunger, and poverty because of the British naval blockade. Upon the realization of impending defeat, the Supreme Army Command, OHL, discussed the grim state of the war with Kaiser Wilhelm II and Chancellor von Hertling, in hopes of a more desirable outcome of the negotiations. Woodrow Wilson's terms of democratization were accepted. In the process of these reforms to a parliamentary monarchy, the newly appointed Chancellor, Max von Baden, hoped to ease conditions in face of the war-weary population. Within the next months, while negotiations went on, the population and, more importantly, the military high command seemed to gradually accept or at least endure the lack of action, which tied their hands, or so it seemed. One crucial part of Woodrow's demands was the cessation of the ongoing submarine war, which despite major outrage of the Admiralty was accepted. This outrage, however, was not meant to be a protest against foreign demands, but the expression of ever-increasing frustration of the Admiralty. Bear in mind that World War I was fairly uneventful in the North Sea, except for the Battle of Jutland. Such a grand degradation seemed unacceptable and caused Admiral Reinhard Scheer to order an attack on the British fleet in a last attempt to save the Navy's honor. The ships soon gathered at Schillig near Wilhelmshaven to concentrate their forces. However, as word of a final attack spread among the sailors, they refused to embark on what they saw as a futile death voyage. The crews of the Thüringen, SMS Kaiserin and SMS Helgoland outright mutinied. For a brief, yet nonetheless tense phase, everything appeared to escalate, but ultimately the rebellious sailors gave up. Still, it was enough to get the planned attack cancelled and the fleet moved to Kiel. With the illusion of control scattered and the spirit of defiance at an all-time high, it didn't take long for the sailors to riot again. By November 4th, the entire city was under the sailors' control, installing soldiers' councils after example of the Russian Soviets. Within days, most major cities had fallen to the revolutionaries. Ultimately, Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the Republic on November 9th. Within the entire month of November, Kaiser Wilhelm and all ruling nobles had been deposed, and the empire has ceased to exist. The German Empire was finished. A quick disclaimer before we start. Even though the title states factions of the German Revolution, some of these were not present specifically in 1918 and 19, and most stretched into the early Weimar period as well or started in there. Just wanted to make that clear since factions of the crisis years of the Weimar Republic wouldn't roll so well off the tongue. With that being said, let's dive in. Der Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, or Social Democratic Party of Germany, was the backbone of the Republican movement, as all other parties at the beginning were still somewhat loyal to the empire. At the time of the revolution, they were the most popular party and seemingly understood to use that momentum. However, this would mean nothing ultimately, as they collapsed through every commie's worst nightmare: factionalism. Essentially, ever since the outbreak of World War I, the party was split into two. While the majority supported the war effort, a more orthodox socialist minority utterly rejected it. By the time of the revolution, this schism caused the split of the party into the MSPD and the USPD. The moderate MSPD pushed for the Republic, but found itself more or less stuck between switching back and forth between the other factions. They advocated for parliamentary democracy, workers' rights, end of militarism, women's suffrage, typical moderate left stuff. Between all the factions, they positioned themselves as a moderate, neither reactionary nor revolutionary. However, with the vast majority of military aligning themselves with either one of the two, they were left pretty impotent and needed to rely on other factions for combat, like the Freikorps, who saw them more as a necessary evil than a reliable ally, and ultimately marked them as traitors in the eyes of the communists. A split which would affect the left for the entirety of the Weimar period. Ah, yes, the Freikorps. It wouldn't be a German Revolution video without them. Now, the Freikorps are a very complex topic, and they totally deserve their own video. But what we need to know here is that Freikorps are essentially paramilitary units who operate independently behind enemy lines. Firstly, coming to prominence during the Seven Years' War and Napoleonic Wars. By 1918-1919, the impending Treaty of Versailles threatened to drastically reduce the size of the army. This was a great threat for many young aspiring officers who are now threatened to lose their prospect of career. In addition to utter resentment regarding their military defeat and loss of the monarchy, these laid the perfect ground for Freikorps. While their political affiliation varied from corps to corps, with everything from Prussian monarchists over Catholic corporatists to racial ultranationalists, what united them all was the shared opposition of communism. Contrary to popular belief, most of the Freikorps were in fact a collection of reactionary aristocratic militias. Around 60% of all Freikorps members were of working class origin, 75% below the age of 25, and only 4% of them active military staff. Their numbers, youthful comprisal, and disciplined structure was exactly what the provisional government desperately needed to fight off the Spartacists. However, keep in mind that this was quite an uneasy alliance, as the Republic of Weimar was seen as equally treasonous as the Bavarian Soviet or the Bremen Council Republic. Often they would defy direct orders and do things their own way. Still, they were quite crucial for the survival of the young republic, especially for eliminating the Spartacist leadership of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Yet it comes to no surprise that ultimately they would become Weimar's worst enemy, as they refused to demobilize. This would directly lead to the rise of Organisation Konsul and the assassination of Rathenau and Erzberger. But in the long run, it had little impact on the course of events, and most ended up being co-opted by either the NSDAP or the Konservative Revolution later in the Weimar period. On the other side of the political spectrum, emboldened by the Russian Revolution and highly supported by the war-weary population initially, the odds for a successful revolution in Germany seemed high, but ultimately failed on the classical leftist flaw of factionalism. This resulted in various groups denouncing and outright sabotaging the other factions, often splintering for minor disagreements. Alright, so now let's come to the first of the revolutionary factions. At first we have the USPD, or the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. Like I said before, the SPD had a major split during the war because of disagreements regarding the involvement in the war. This led to the minority around Karl Liebknecht to split off and form the USPD. The USPD positioned themselves as a middle path between the reformists and the revolutionaries, and they opposed the war, demanded peace without annexations, and sought greater democracy, which in basic terms translates to the council republics we would see later in the course of the German Revolution. When the revolution then ultimately broke out in 1918, the USPD was torn. On one side, they wanted to represent workers and soldiers' councils in a classical grassroots movement, but on the other side, they still believed in the parliamentary politics, and this made them pretty much unable to gain significant momentum. They briefly joined the SPD in forming the Council of People's Deputies, in which they hold 2 seats. However, they quickly collapsed over their disagreements, primarily with the army and the conservative elite, who were already suppressing the radical uprisings in the country. The USPD would never fully resolve this identity crisis which had between parliamentarianism and radicalism. The moderates of the MSPD deemed them too radical, and the communists deemed them too cautious. Many of its members eventually drifted to the newly founded Communist Party of Germany, KPD, while others would eventually repent and rejoin the SPD. During the revolution, they were kind of the link between the moderates and the extremes, so to say, but they quickly failed to actually organize into a nationwide movement and pretty much splintered into their regional parts, most prominently in the Bavarian Soviet Republic under Kurt Eisner. This would ultimately lead to them being very impotent, and after Liebknecht and Luxemburg joined the KPD and were then executed by the Freikorps later, they pretty much lost all momentum. While the USPD was still very much torn between two worlds, the Spartacist League was firmly in the camp of revolution. Born out of the anti-war left inside the SPD and led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the Spartacists represented the uncompromising revolutionary wing of the German socialists. They denounced the war from day one, with Liebknecht being the only SPD deputy to vote against the war credits in 1914, for which he would end up being arrested. When the war then came to a close in November 1918, the Spartacists quickly began to organize into their own councils in the major cities and defying orders from the parliament. Yet here's the key: the Spartacist League was small, numbering only a few thousand dedicated members. They had massive influence in radical circles, but lacked the organizational base to lead millions of workers. Still, they refused to compromise, and in January 1919 they helped to inspire the Spartacist uprising in Berlin, which would be their most prominent occurrence in the entire revolution. Ultimately, however, it was crushed by the Freikorps, and with that, after Luxemburg and Liebknecht were ultimately arrested and executed, they quickly lost momentum and failed to gain steam during the course of the following years. Out of the Spartacist League and radical members of the USPD, the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany was born in late December 1918. Unlike the USPD and MSPD, who still had elements of democratic socialism and social democracy, the KPD was clear in its mission to turn the German Revolution into a full socialist revolution inspired by the recent success of the Bolsheviks in Russia. The KPD declared war on capitalism, calling for the abolition of private property in industry, workers' control of production, and power to the councils. It was not interested in any compromise with the old order. But from the very beginning, the KPD faced massive challenges. First, it was small and isolated. Many workers still followed the SPD or USPD. Second, it struggled with strategy. Some KPD leaders rejected parliamentary elections altogether, seeing them as a trap. This alienated parts of the working class who still had faith in democracy. After the failed Spartacist uprising in 1919, the young KPD saw themselves under enormous pressure from not only the state but also competing communist groups who saw them as very much impotent and treasonous. For that, they lacked any significant momentum and needed to rely on support by the Bolsheviks in Moscow, which would be resolved in the Soviets having significant influence in the policies of the KPD throughout the entire Weimar period. And while they did eventually become a formidable force during the later years of the Weimar Republic and gaining votes in the millions, still it's unclear how much they actually were controlled by the Soviets, but it's clear that the influence was immense. But with the expulsion of the Soviets in Poland, they pretty much lost all real connection to them and needed to rely on their own and were thus easily crushed in over the uprising. They thus focused more on actual elections, in whom they actually built a sizable amount of voters. While workers and soldiers in Berlin were debating socialism in councils, another question was stirring in Western Germany. Should the Rhineland break away from Berlin altogether? The Rhineland, long a borderland contested between France and Germany, had a unique identity. After the war, French troops occupied the region under the terms of the armistice. French officials encouraged local separatists, hoping to weaken Germany and perhaps create a friendly buffer state. Some Rhineland politicians and businessmen, wary of Berlin's instability and fearful of revolution, flirted with the idea of independence. They dreamed of a Rhenish republic, perhaps under French protection. But these separatist attempts never gained mass support. For most workers and farmers in the Rhineland, separatism appeared to be treason, selling out to France, the old arch-enemy. The peak came in early 1919 when separatist committees declared a Rhenish Republic in cities like Koblenz and Mainz. But without a real base among the people and facing hostility from both the German nationalists and the revolutionaries, the movement collapsed quickly. France backing down wasn't enough. The Rhineland remained part of Germany, though the idea of independence would resurface again in the 1920s. Fun fact, later German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in fact was an advocate for the Rhenish independence, even though he denied it later altogether. If separatism in the Rhineland was half-hearted, in Posen it was fierce, organized and successful. Posen was a province with a large Polish population, long under German rule since the partitions of Poland. With Germany's defeat in 1918, the Poles saw their chance to annex their old lands. On December 27, 1918, just weeks after the Kaiser's abdication, the Greater Poland Uprising erupted in Posen. Polish insurgents, supported by returning soldiers and volunteers, seized control of towns and railways, often clashing with the German troops of Grenzschutz Ost. The uprising quickly spread across the province. For the Polish movement, this wasn't just separatism, it was national liberation. They aimed to unite with the newly independent Polish state being re-established under Józef Pilsudski. German authorities, already overwhelmed by revolution at home, struggled to respond. Fighting continued into early 1919 until an armistice was brokered. At the Versailles Peace Conference, the outcome was sealed. Posen was transferred to Poland. Unlike the Rhineland, separatism had succeeded, backed by national identity, armed struggle and international diplomacy. When the first years of the 20s came to a close, armed conflict gradually died out. Against all odds, the young republic seemed to have prevailed. Both sides of the political extremes failed to successfully gather necessary support for a takeover. However, it would be wrong to speak of a Republican triumph. The utter humiliation left by Versailles, paired with the ongoing influence of the Soviets among German communists, would continue to spark political violence throughout the decade. And while the general population seemed to more or less come to terms with the new regime, thanks to the economic prosperity of the late years, it ultimately was trust built on comfort. Because in the end, a comfortable life can't hide the ugly sides of life. The Weimar Republic was a period of excessive degeneracy, such as pornography, drugs, crime, to just name a few. When 29 ultimately crashed the standard of living, all support for the status quo dwindled, and both extremes of left and right were again ready to sway the masses, which ultimately resulted in the victory of the NSDAP in 33.